Every empire built on fear carries one fatal flaw buried inside its architect. For Duke Caedric Dravenmoor, that flaw arrived wearing a dead man's name and a stare that refused to break. The northern territories had kneeled for 11 years beneath his shadow. Entire bloodlines had been erased for less than a whispered insult. Yet on the night Lady Seraphina Vale was dragged before his court in chains forged from her father's confiscated iron, something cracked behind the wall of ice this man had spent a lifetime constructing. Stay until the last word falls. This story earns every second it takes from you. The cathedral hall of Blackthorn Keep swallowed sound the way deep water swallows the drowned. Vaulted ceilings stretched 60 feet overhead, blackened by decades of torch smoke and the residue of political violence conducted beneath expensive architecture. Stone pillars thick as ancient oaks lined the central corridor in pairs, each one carved with the snarling wolf crest of House Dravenmoor, each one older than the dynasty it represented. Caedric stood at the far end of that corridor, behind a war table built from the hull of a captured enemy vessel. He was not sitting. He never sat during briefings. Sitting implied a man who needed rest, and rest implied vulnerability, and vulnerability was the single currency Caedric Dravenmoor refused to trade in. Captain Edric Voss stood across the table, armored in black leather reinforced with steel plating across the shoulders and forearms. His face carried the permanent tension of a man who delivered unpleasant truths to dangerous people for a living. 3 merchant convoys burned on the eastern pass, Voss said flatly. Lord Garen's men. They torched them before dawn and scattered the survivors into the thornwood. Garen's 5th provocation this season, but Caedric's voice carried no inflection. It never did when he was calculating. 6th, Voss corrected, if you count the poisoning attempt on your tax collector in Ashenmere. I count it. Silence filled the hall like smoke. 2 officers standing near the doorway shifted uncomfortably. They had served the Duke long enough to recognize the quality of quiet that preceded irreversible decisions. Pull the garrison from Fort Callan, Caedric said. Redistribute them to the ridgeline above Garen's western farmland. Voss frowned. That positions them for a siege approach, not a defensive hold. I am aware of what it positions them for. My lord, if the Crown perceives this as an offensive deployment against a titled nobleman, the Crown perceives whatever I allow it to perceive. Caedric lifted his gaze from the map, and the temperature in the room dropped measurably. Lord Garen burns my convoys because he believes distance protects him from consequence. Remove that belief. Permanently. Voss exhaled through his nose but said nothing further. He had watched this pattern enough times to understand the arithmetic. Provocation was answered with disproportionate force. Disproportionate force produced silence. Silence produced obedience, and obedience was the only relationship Caedric maintained with the world outside these walls. After the officers filed out, Caedric remained alone in the cathedral hall. The firelight turned his shadow into something monstrous against the far wall, stretched and distorted until it covered half the stone floor like a second presence living inside the room. He was 34 years old. He had inherited the Dravenmoor title at 23 after his father choked on his own blood during a banquet, poison administered by a cousin whose name had since been scraped from every family record. In the 11 years since, Caedric had transformed the Northern Territories from a fractured collection of feuding estates into the most economically and militarily dominant region in Valedorn. The iron mines alone funded an army larger than the Crown's standing forces. The frozen ports controlled 70% of the kingdom's northern trade. None of it had been given to him. All of it had been taken, and taking required a specific kind of emptiness that most men could not sustain without eventually collapsing under the weight of what it cost. Caedric had not collapsed. He had calcified. The grief of watching his father die while servants stood paralyzed had hardened into something structural, load-bearing walls inside his chest where softer men kept sentiment. He did not trust. He did not forgive. He did not desire anything he could not control completely, because desire without control was just another word for someone else's leverage. That was the architecture he had built himself into. That was the architecture Seraphina Vale was about to demolish. The royal summons arrived by rider at dawn 3 days later. King Matthias had ordered all titled nobility to attend the autumn tribunal at the capital, an annual ceremony disguised as governance where the crown publicly reaffirmed its authority over the aristocracy. In practice, it was theater. The real negotiations happened in corridors and bedchambers long before the formal proceedings began. Caedric despised the tribunal. He despised the capital. He despised the performative rituals of a monarchy that survived only because men like him permitted it to survive. But refusing the summons would give his enemies ammunition, and Caedric understood that the most dangerous weapon in aristocratic warfare was not steel. It was narrative. He rode south with a retinue of 40 armed men, Voss at his right flank, and arrived at the royal palace 3 hours before the opening ceremony. The palace itself was an architectural insult compared to Blackthorn Keep, all gilded facades and decorative gardens designed to project wealth without substance. The hallways smelled of rosewater and political desperation. The ballroom where the tribunal convened was already thick with nobility by the time Caedric entered. Hundreds of aristocrats packed the chamber in silks and velvets, their conversations a low drone of strategic flattery and poisonous gossip. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings depicting mythological scenes no one in the room actually believed in. Everything was designed to overwhelm the senses into submission. The room noticed Caedric immediately. Conversations died in concentric circles outward from the entrance, like ripples spreading through disturbed water. Heads turned. Spines straightened. Several noble women openly stared while their husbands guided them firmly in the opposite direction. Caedric wore black. He always wore black, not as affectation, but as declaration. He carried no ceremonial sword because the broadsword strapped across his back was not ceremonial. His coat bore no embroidery, no jeweled clasps, no decorative concession to the occasion. He dressed the way he governed, with absolute disregard for the expectations of lesser men. "The Duke of Dravenmoor," a court herald announced unnecessarily. Every person in the room already knew. King Matthias observed from the elevated throne at the far end of the hall. He was a careful man, politically cautious, neither strong enough to challenge Caedric, nor weak enough to be dismissed entirely. Beside him stood Prince Aldric, younger, sharper, with the restless eyes of someone perpetually calculating the distance between himself and the crown. Aldric smiled when Caedric entered. Caedric noted it, filed it. Smiles from ambitious men were never gifts. They were receipts for transactions that had not yet been revealed. The tribunal proceeded with its usual tedium: land disputes, tax grievances, border negotiations between minor lords who lacked the military strength to resolve their own conflicts. Caedric stood against a marble pillar near the western wall and watched the proceedings with the patience of a predator observing prey argue over territory that would eventually belong to neither of them. Then the doors opened again. 2 royal guards entered first. Between them walked a woman in chains. The metal links were decorative, thin iron links connected to leather cuffs, the kind used for political prisoners of noble birth rather than common criminals. But chains were chains regardless of their craftsmanship, and every aristocrat in the ballroom understood the statement being made. The woman was tall. Dark hair fell past her shoulders in tangled waves that suggested she had not been given the courtesy of preparation before being presented. Her gown was plain gray linen, stripped of any house insignia, any color, any identity. They had dressed her in erasure, but her face destroyed the effect entirely. She walked through that ballroom full of titled predators with an expression that carried neither fear nor submission. Her jaw was set. Her shoulders were back. Her eyes swept the room with a measured intensity that catalogued every face, every reaction, every threat, and dismissed them all simultaneously. Lady Seraphina Vale, 26 years old, daughter of the late Duke Aldrin Vale, executed for treason against the crown 8 months prior. Her family's estates had been seized. Her younger brother had vanished into political exile somewhere across the southern border. Everything the Vale name once represented had been systematically dismantled until only this woman remained. The last fragment of a shattered bloodline dragged before the court as evidence that the crown's justice was absolute. "The prisoner, Lady Seraphina Vale," the herald announced, "brought before the tribunal for disposition of remaining debts owed by House Vale to the kingdom of Valedorn." Seraphina's gaze found King Matthias on his throne. She did not bow. The crowd murmured. "Lady Vale," the king began carefully, "your father's crimes against this kingdom are well documented. His execution satisfied the demands of justice, but the debts of House Vale remain outstanding. Significant financial obligations to multiple noble houses, territorial claims left unresolved, and the question of your own status within the aristocracy. My status, Seraphina repeated. Her voice was clear and carried further than it should have in a room this large. You mean my disposal? The murmuring intensified. Noble women pressed fans against their mouths. Several lords exchanged glances loaded with political calculation. The king's jaw tightened. The tribunal will determine appropriate guardianship and settlement of debts. Several houses have expressed willingness to absorb the remaining Vale obligations in exchange for me. Seraphina's tone did not waver. Let us not decorate slavery with legal vocabulary, Your Majesty. The silence that followed was severe. No one addressed the king with that kind of raw honesty in open court. It was not done. It was not survived. Prince Aldrich leaned forward in his chair with open fascination, and from the western pillar, Caedric Dravenmoor watched with an intensity he had not felt in years. Something moved beneath his composure, not attraction, not pity, something far more dangerous, recognition. He knew that expression on her face. He had worn it himself the night his father died, and every surviving member of the household looked at him like meat being appraised for division, the expression of someone surrounded by predators who had already decided to stop running and start calculating. The tribunal erupted into negotiation. Lord Fenwick of the eastern provinces offered to absorb the Vale debts in exchange for Seraphina's hand in marriage, a transparent land grab disguised as generosity. Lord Heron countered with a larger financial offer. Two minor houses submitted formal proposals through their representatives, each one treating Seraphina like territory to be annexed rather than a person standing 6 feet away listening to her own auction. Seraphina stood motionless through all of it. Her chains clinked softly each time she shifted her weight. Her face remained unreadable, but Caedric watched her hands. The fingers were curled into fists so tight the knuckles had gone white. She was not calm. She was containing something volcanic beneath a surface engineered to deny these men the satisfaction of watching it erupt. Caedric pushed himself off the pillar and walked toward the center of the room. The movement alone silenced half the chamber. When Duke Dravenmoor moved with purpose through a crowd, people cleared the path instinctively, the same way animals scatter from a predator's trajectory without consciously understanding why. The debts of House Vale, Caedric said, and his voice cut through the residual murmuring like a blade through parchment. Total outstanding obligations, including territorial penalties and crown-imposed fines. What is the figure? The king's treasurer stammered through his papers. Approximately 47,000 gold sovereigns, my lord. Caedric did not blink. I will cover the full amount. The ballroom went silent with the totality of a held breath. 47,000 gold sovereigns was a staggering sum. Enough to fund a small army for 2 years, enough to purchase 3 noble estates outright. And Caedric had claimed it the way another man might claim a dinner bill. King Matthias stared. Duke Dravenmoor, the settlement requires guardianship arrangements. The remaining member of House Vale must be placed under noble supervision until she will reside at Blackthorn Keep. Caedric turned to face Seraphina directly for the first time. Under my authority. The distance between them was less than 10 feet, close enough that he could see the rapid pulse in her throat, close enough that she could see the absolute absence of mercy in his expression. You belong to me now, he said. Not quietly, not privately. He said it loud enough for every aristocrat in the tribunal to hear. Seraphina's fist tightened until the chains rattled against her wrists. Her breathing changed, faster, controlled, the rhythm of someone physically restraining themselves from violence. I belong, she said slowly, to no one. Your father's debts say otherwise. My father is dead. His debts died with him. The law disagrees. Caedric closed the remaining distance between them until he stood near enough to lower his voice, though he chose not to. And in this kingdom, I am considerably more persuasive than the law. The crowd watched in frozen silence. This was not negotiation. This was conquest conducted in real time, beneath crystal chandeliers, while orchestras waited with instruments suspended mid-note. Prince Aldrich's smile widened from the elevated platform. His eyes moved between Caedric and Seraphina with the careful attention of a man watching two pieces on a game board align exactly where he wanted them. King Matthias exhaled heavily. The political calculation was visible on his face. Refusing the Duke of Dravenmoor in open court carried consequences no monarch wanted to trigger. Caedric's wealth funded half the kingdom's military infrastructure. His iron mind supplied the crown's armories. Denying him would be principled. It would also be economically catastrophic. The tribunal accepts Duke Dravenmoor's settlement of House Vale's debts, the king announced wearily. Lady Seraphina Vale is hereby placed under the guardianship of House Dravenmoor until such time as the tribunal deems appropriate. Seraphina turned her gaze from the king to Caedric. There was no gratitude in it, no relief. What he saw there was something he had not encountered directed at himself in over a decade. Pure, unfiltered defiance. "You have purchased a debt," she said quietly enough that only he could hear. "Not a person. Learn the difference before we reach your castle, or I will teach it to you in ways you will not enjoy." Caedric held her stare for a long moment. Then he turned to Voss, who had materialized 2 steps behind him, with the disciplined silence of a man who knew when to appear. "Remove the chains," Caedric said. "She rides with my retinue." "The protocol requires—" "I said remove them." Voss removed them. The journey north took 4 days through increasingly brutal terrain. The roads narrowed as they climbed out of the capital's manicured lowlands into the raw geography of the northern territories. Granite ridges, black pine forests so dense the canopy blocked sunlight by midday, and rivers swollen with snowmelt that roared through ravines carved over centuries of erosion. Seraphina rode near the center of the column on a horse she had been given without ceremony. She spoke to no one. She ate what was provided and slept in the tent assigned to her without complaint or gratitude. She observed everything with the systematic attention of someone memorizing the environment for future use. Caedric watched her from the front of the column the way he watched all potential threats, constantly, peripherally, without revealing that he was watching at all. On the second night, camped beside a frozen river beneath a sky so clear the stars looked like wounds in the darkness, Voss approached Caedric's tent with the careful stride of a man about to say something inadvisable. "She has not spoken to anyone since we departed the capital. I am aware. She has not cried." Caedric looked up from the military correspondence he was reviewing. Why would she cry? Her father was executed, her family destroyed. She was publicly claimed as property by a man the entire kingdom fears. Most people would exhibit some emotional response. Most people are not her. Caedric returned his attention to the documents. "That is precisely the problem." "Problem?" Voss's tone sharpened slightly. "My lord, with respect, you just spent 47,000 gold sovereigns and publicly humiliated a woman before the entire aristocracy. If you wanted a compliant ward, there were considerably cheaper options." Caedric set down his pen. "Aldrin Vale uncovered something before he was executed," he said quietly. "Something significant enough that the crown killed him to bury it. His daughter is the only surviving person who might know what it was." Voss processed this. "And if she does not know? Then she is still the last heir of a house that was destroyed for discovering the wrong secret. Every faction in this kingdom with involvement in that secret wants her dead or silenced. I have made both options considerably more difficult by placing her under my protection." "Protection?" Voss tasted the word skeptically. "Is that what we're calling it?" "What would you call it?" "Possession." Caedric's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of self-awareness that surfaced briefly before being submerged beneath the discipline of a man who had trained himself not to examine his own motives too closely. "Ensure her tent is guarded," he said. "2 men at all times." "For her protection?" "For mine." Blackthorn Keep emerged from the mountain landscape like a threat carved in stone. The fortress dominated the coastline from a cliff face that dropped 300 feet into churning northern seas. Its towers were black granite, its walls reinforced with iron bracings that had survived sieges, storms, and centuries of relentless wind. The surrounding forest pressed against the outer walls like something trying to reclaim territory it had lost. Seraphina's face did not change when she saw it. Caedric was watching. He saw the micro-expression she suppressed. Not fear, but the recalibration of someone adjusting their understanding of what they were dealing with. Inside the gates, the household assembled in rigid formation. Servants in Dravenmoor livery lined the courtyard corridors. Steward Marin Ashford stood at the entrance to the main hall with the posture and expression of a woman who had managed this fortress through every crisis of the past 11 years and considered the arrival of a political hostage merely the latest logistical challenge. "Lady Vale," Marin said with professional precision, "quarters have been prepared in the East Tower. I will escort you personally." "The East Tower!" Seraphina glanced upward at the structure, isolated, accessible only through a single fortified corridor, windows too narrow for passage. How thoughtful. A comfortable cage. Marin's expression did not flicker. The East Tower offers the finest views of the northern coastline. Many guests have found it quite pleasant. "I am not a guest." "No," Marin agreed without inflection. "You are not." Caedric dismounted and handed his reins to a stable hand without looking at the man. "Marin, dinner will be served in the main hall tonight. Lady Vale will attend." Seraphina turned toward him. "Will she? You may eat alone in the tower if you prefer, but the household will interpret absence as weakness, and the staff of Blackthorn Keep have far less patience for weakness than I do." The challenge landed exactly where he intended it. Seraphina's chin lifted fractionally, an unconscious gesture of someone accepting combat terms. "I will attend," she said, "though I hope your cook is more talented than your hospitality." That night, the main hall of Blackthorn Keep was lit by iron chandeliers holding 100 candles each, their flames trembling in the drafts that haunted every corridor of the ancient fortress. A long table dominated the center of the hall, set with pewter plates and heavy crystal goblets that refracted the firelight into scattered fragments across the stone walls. Caedric sat at the head. Seraphina was placed at his right, a position of honor that was simultaneously a position of surveillance. Voss sat opposite, along with several senior officers of the household guard and 2 visiting merchants from the coastal trading ports. The meal began in careful silence. Roasted game, dark bread, wine from southern vineyards that Caedric imported despite his open contempt for everything south of the mountain passes. One of the merchants, a thick-necked man named Dalton, who traded in timber and had the conversational subtlety of a falling tree, attempted to break the tension. "Lady Vale, a pleasure to have beauty grace this fortress. It has been a long time since Blackthorn Keep hosted a woman of noble birth." Seraphina set down her knife. "Is that your attempt at flattery, or are you simply observing that the Duke surrounds himself exclusively with armed men and silence?" Dalton's smile curdled. Voss suppressed a sound that might have been amusement. Caedric continued eating without visible reaction, though the corner of his mouth moved by approximately 1 millimeter. "The Duke's priorities are military and economic," Marin interjected smoothly from her position near the hall entrance. "Aesthetic considerations have traditionally ranked lower." "Clearly," Seraphina observed, glancing around the bare stone walls. Caedric set down his goblet. "You have opinions about my home." "I have observations. Opinions require caring enough to form them." "Then observe carefully." He met her eyes across the candlelight. "Because this home is now yours as well, whether you choose to care about it or not." "It is not my home. It is my prison. The distinction matters." "The distinction," Caedric said quietly, "is entirely determined by behavior." The table went silent. The merchants studied their plates with intense focus. The officers maintained expressions of disciplined neutrality. Only Voss watched openly, his gaze moving between the Duke and his ward with the careful attention of a man tracking the trajectory of something about to explode. Seraphina held Caedric's stare for a long, combustible moment. "Then I suppose," she said finally, "we will both discover what my behavior looks like when confined against my will." She rose from the table without permission, without excuse, and walked out of the hall. Her footsteps echoed through the corridor long after she disappeared. Dalton cleared his throat. "Spirited woman." Caedric's hand tightened around his goblet until the metal stem bent slightly under the pressure. He did not respond. Over the following weeks, Blackthorn Keep transformed into a battlefield disguised as domesticity. Seraphina attended every formal occasion. She appeared at every council session Caedric held in the main hall. She dined at his table every night, and at every single occasion she waged a quiet, relentless campaign of resistance that targeted not his authority, but the machinery that sustained it. She befriended the kitchen staff. She learned the names of every servant in the household within the first week. She walked the corridors and courtyards with a freedom that tested the boundaries of her confinement without technically violating them. She asked questions about the iron mines, about the trading routes, about the military deployments along the northern border, that demonstrated a strategic intelligence Caedric found increasingly difficult to dismiss. And she challenged him, constantly, precisely. With the surgical accuracy of someone who had studied power structures her entire life and understood exactly where to apply pressure. During a council meeting with 3 northern lords who had traveled to Blackthorn Keep to negotiate mining rights, Seraphina sat in the observation gallery above the hall and listened silently for 2 hours. When the session ended and the lords departed, she descended the gallery stairs and approached the war table where Caedric stood reviewing the proposed agreements. "Lord Cresswell is lying about the yield projections for the North March mines," she said without preamble. Caedric looked up. "You are not invited to these sessions." You did not bar the gallery, an oversight or an invitation. Either way, Cresswell inflated his numbers by approximately 30%. My father negotiated with him twice before. He uses the same technique each time. Aggressive initial projections to establish a high baseline, then concedes gradually to a number that still exceeds fair value by a comfortable margin. The silence stretched. Caedric studied her with an expression she could not read, frustration, admiration, or something more complicated tangling behind his controlled features. "Your father taught you to read mining contracts?" "My father taught me to read men. The contracts are secondary." "And what do you read when you look at me?" Seraphina considered this. The candlelight turned her features into planes of light and shadow, her dark eyes steady and unafraid. "A man who has built an empire out of the terror of being powerless again," she said. "Every wall, every soldier, every act of brutality is not about strength. It is about making absolutely certain that what happened to you can never happen again. You do not rule because you love power. You rule because you cannot survive without it." The hall was empty. The torches guttered in the draft. Somewhere below the fortress, the sea hammered against the cliff face with the rhythmic persistence of something trying to break through. Caedric did not move. He did not speak. But for a fraction of a second, something raw and unguarded surfaced in his expression before he sealed it shut with the practiced speed of a man slamming a door against a storm. "You presume to understand me," he said softly. "I do not presume. I observe." She took a step closer. "And what I observe is a man who is terrified of the one thing his fortress cannot protect him from." "Which is?" "Being known." The word landed between them like a blade driven into the table. Caedric's jaw clenched, his hands pressed flat against the war table's surface with controlled force. "Go back to the tower, Lady Vale." "As you command, my lord." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "But commands do not erase what was said. You know that better than anyone in this castle." She left. Caedric stood alone in the hall for a very long time after that. The fire burned down to embers. The shadows deepened until the wolf crests on the pillars seemed to shift and breathe in the dying light. And somewhere beneath the iron architecture of his composure, a fracture appeared, thin as a hairline, invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. But fractures in load-bearing walls never stay invisible for long. 2 weeks after that conversation, a raven arrived at Blackthorn Keep bearing the royal seal. Merrin brought the message to Caedric's private study, where he sat behind a desk made from the same black iron as the fortress walls. He broke the seal, read the contents, and his expression, always controlled, always calibrated, went completely still. Not calm. Still. The way the air goes still before something catastrophic. "Merrin." "My lord?" "Summon Captain Voss. Immediately." When Voss arrived, Caedric handed him the letter without explanation. Voss read it. His face drained of color. "The king has formally invited all titled nobility to the Winter Ascension Ball at the Royal Palace," Voss said carefully. Attendance is mandatory, and Lady Seraphina Vale is specifically named in the summons. Caedric stared out the study window at the Black Sea crashing beneath the cliffs. Prince Aldrich requested the summons personally, he said. He wants her at the palace. He wants her visible, exposed. Then we refuse. A mandatory royal summons cannot be refused without formal justification, and any justification I provide reveals that I am protecting her, which reveals that she has value, which makes her a target for every faction that wants leverage against me. Voss set the letter down slowly. Then we attend, and we prepare for whatever Aldrich is planning. Caedric turned from the window. The firelight caught his face at an angle that stripped away everything civilized about his features, leaving only the geometry of a man who had been forged in violence and never fully emerged from it. Tell Seraphina, he said. She needs to know what we are walking into. Voss hesitated. And what exactly are we walking into? Caedric's gaze hardened into something that had ended the careers, fortunes, and lives of men far more powerful than Prince Aldrich. A trap, he said, one designed specifically for her, and whoever built it made a critical miscalculation, which is, they forgot that she is mine, and I do not lose what is mine. Far below the fortress, the northern sea threw itself against the cliffs of Blackthorn Keep with the blind fury of something that had been trying to tear down the stone for centuries. It had not yet succeeded, but inside the walls something quieter and infinitely more dangerous was already doing what the ocean could not. Seraphina did not react the way Caedric expected when Voss delivered the news. She was standing in the East Tower's main chamber, beside a window overlooking the northern sea, when the captain entered and laid out the situation with military brevity. The royal summons, the mandatory attendance, Prince Aldrich's specific request for her presence, the near certainty that the entire event was engineered to accomplish something none of them could yet identify. Seraphina listened to every word without interrupting. When Voss finished, she turned from the window with an expression that was neither frightened nor defiant. It was analytical. "When do we leave?" she asked. Voss glanced at the doorway behind him, where Caedric stood in shadow, arms crossed, watching the exchange without announcing his presence. A habit. He observed people most accurately when they did not know they were being observed. 5 days, Voss said. The ball is in 9. We ride hard. And the Duke believes this is a trap designed for me specifically. The Duke believes Prince Aldrich does not request anything without strategic purpose. Your name on that summons is not courtesy. It is positioning. Seraphina absorbed this. Her fingers traced the stone windowsill absently, a gesture Caedric had begun cataloging. She touched surfaces when she was processing, as though physical contact with solid material grounded her thinking. Then Prince Aldrich needs me visible for a reason, she said, which means whatever he is planning requires a public audience. He cannot accomplish it privately, or he already would have. Voss said nothing. He had the professional discipline not to confirm intelligence assessments made by someone technically classified as a prisoner. Caedric stepped out of the shadow. You understand political architecture, he said. Seraphina's head turned. She did not startle. She had known he was there. That realization landed inside Caedric's chest with an unfamiliar weight. She had spoken freely in front of the doorway, knowing he was listening, which meant every word had been chosen for 2 audiences simultaneously. I am the daughter of a man who was executed for understanding too much of it, she replied. Architecture was the family trade. Your father's understanding got him killed. My father's understanding got him murdered. There is a difference between consequences earned and consequences manufactured. The distinction was not subtle. Caedric heard it clearly. She believed her father was framed. She believed the treason charges were fabricated, and she was telling him this openly, in front of his captain, without any attempt to conceal the implication. Either she trusted him enough to be honest, or she was testing whether honesty would get her killed. Caedric studied her for a long moment. The tower room was cold, lit by a single iron candelabra that threw long shadows across the bare stone walls. Outside, wind screamed through the cliff face with the sound of something grieving. What did your father discover? He asked. Seraphina's expression shifted. The analytical detachment softened into something guarded, something raw that she immediately fought to conceal. He watched her jaw tighten, watched her breathing change. 2 shorter breaths followed by one deliberate deep inhale, the rhythm of someone physically controlling an emotional response through force of will. "If I knew that," she said quietly, "I would already be dead." The preparation for departure consumed Blackthorn Keep for 3 days. Caedric tripled the traveling guard contingent. 60 armed riders plus supply wagons, outriders positioned a half-mile ahead of the main column, and 2 scouts who would arrive at the capital separately to establish intelligence positions before the retinue appeared. Voss coordinated the logistics with the grim efficiency of a man preparing for a military operation rather than a social engagement. On the evening before departure, Caedric found himself in the armory beneath the main hall. He was not selecting weapons. He had chosen his armament hours ago. He was standing in a room full of steel and leather and the smell of oil used to prevent rust, and he was trying to identify the source of the agitation moving through his body like a current he could not ground. 47,000 gold sovereigns, a public declaration of ownership before the entire aristocracy. The most strategically exposed position he had occupied in 11 years of calculated dominance. All of it centered on a woman who had been inside his fortress for less than 2 months and had already identified the structural weakness he had spent a lifetime concealing. Being known. She had said it like a diagnosis, like a physician naming the disease that a patient had been misidentifying as strength for decades. And the worst part, the part that had kept Caedric awake on 3 consecutive nights, staring at the ceiling of his chambers while the fortress groaned around him in the wind, was that she had been right. He did not fear enemies. Enemies were simple. They wanted something he had, and he either destroyed them or absorbed their resources before they could take it. The arithmetic of opposition was clean. What he feared was transparency, the sensation of being seen through the architecture he had constructed around himself, because the architecture was not decoration, it was structural. Remove it, and the man behind it would have to reckon with the specific shape of damage that had made the walls necessary in the first place. The boy who watched his father choke on poison while the household staff calculated their own survival instead of intervening. The 23-year-old who inherited a collapsing duchy and discovered that grief was a luxury available only to men who could afford to be weak. Caedric had not been able to afford weakness at 23. He could not afford it now. And yet here he was, deploying 60 soldiers and risking open confrontation with the crown to protect a woman whose primary weapon against him was the ability to see what he actually was. He wrapped his hand around the grip of a mounted broadsword on the wall and squeezed until the metal bit into his palm. Control, he reminded himself. Control was the only thing that separated men who survived from men who became cautionary tales told at aristocratic dinners. The road south was faster this time. Caedric pushed the column harder, sleeping 4 hours per night, demanding dawn departures regardless of weather. The terrain fought them. Freezing rain on the second day turned the mountain passes into rivers of mud that sucked at the horses' legs and slowed the wagons to a grinding crawl. Seraphina rode without complaint. She handled her horse with a competence that suggested aristocratic training. Vale family estates had reportedly maintained some of the finest stables in the eastern provinces before the seizure, but it was more than technical skill. She rode the way she did everything else, with an economy of movement that refused to waste energy on performance. On the third night, camped in a narrow valley between 2 granite ridges, Caedric walked the perimeter of the camp with Voss in the kind of silence that accumulates between men who have shared enough violence to communicate without words. "She is not what I anticipated," Caedric said eventually. "No," Voss agreed. "She does not behave like a prisoner." "She does not behave like anyone I have encountered." Caedric stopped walking. The campfires behind them threw their shadows long across the frozen ground. "That concerns you." "Everything about this situation concerns me." Voss turned to face him directly. "You brought a woman into Blackthorn Keep because you believe she might hold intelligence about a conspiracy that killed her father. In 2 months, she has learned the names of every member of your household, memorized your council schedules, identified flaws in a mining negotiation that your own advisors missed, and psychologically profiled you with an accuracy that visibly rattled the most controlled man I have ever known." He paused. "That is not a prisoner. That is an operator. Or a survivor. The distinction is academic. Survivors and operators use the same skill set. The difference is whether they deploy it for self-preservation or for purpose. You have not yet determined which one she is. Caedric resumed walking. The wind carried the smell of pine and frozen earth and something older, something mineral and permanent that came from the stone itself. And you think I should determine it before we reach the capital? I think Prince Aldrich has already determined it. I think he knows exactly what she is and exactly what she knows. And the Winter Ball is the stage he has chosen to use both against you. And I think you are walking into it with your attention divided between the threat in front of you and the woman beside you, and that division will get one or both of you killed. Caedric said nothing for a long time. The camp sounds drifted through the darkness, horses shifting, low conversation, the crack of burning wood. My attention is not divided, he said finally. Voss looked at him with the expression of a man who had earned the right to disagree without saying so. They arrived at the capital on the afternoon of the fourth day. The royal city spread across the lowland basin like a display of everything Caedric found contemptible about southern governance. Gilded spires, ornamental gardens, boulevards wide enough to accommodate ceremonial processions but narrow enough to bottleneck military formations. The entire city was designed for spectacle rather than defense, which told Caedric everything he needed to know about the men who built it. The Dravenmoor retinue was assigned quarters in the eastern wing of the palace, a diplomatic gesture that positioned them far from the royal chambers and close to the servants' corridors. Caedric noted the placement without comment. The distance was deliberate. Someone wanted to ensure his access to the king required crossing the entire palace, maximizing the number of potential observation points along the route. Aldrich's influence on the housing assignments, Voss confirmed after surveying the quarters. The eastern wing has 4 separate choke points between our rooms and the ballroom. I counted 5. The 5th is behind the tapestry hall. I had it checked. Sealed passage, but recently maintained. The hinges were oiled within the last month. Caedric filed this. Post 2 men on it. Rotating shifts. No one enters or exits without my knowledge. The evening before the ball, a formal reception was held in the palace's lesser hall, a gathering ostensibly designed for arriving nobility to reacquaint themselves before the main event. In practice, it was the opening round of the political combat that the ball itself would escalate. Caedric entered with Seraphina at his right side. The effect was immediate and visceral. She had been provided appropriate attire from the Dravenmoor resources, a gown of deep midnight blue that bore no house insignia, no jewelry, no ornamentation of any kind. The simplicity was deliberate. Every other woman in the room was armored in silk, gemstones, and the competitive display of inherited wealth. Seraphina's plainness was a provocation. It declared that she did not need to compete because she was not playing the same game. Heads turned, conversations fractured. Lady Heron, wife of the Eastern Lord who had attempted to purchase Seraphina at the tribunal, stared with an expression that combined fascination and hatred in equal measure. Lady Vale. Lord Fenwick materialized from the crowd with the predatory grace of a man who had spent decades disguising aggression as courtesy. How remarkable to see you at court again. I had assumed Blackthorn Keep would have dampened your social inclinations. Lord Fenwick, Seraphina's voice carried the same measured clarity that had silenced the tribunal months ago. How generous of you to assume I have social inclinations at all. Fenwick's smile thinned. His gaze shifted to Caedric. Duke Dravenmoor, your ward appears to have inherited her father's talent for making allies uncomfortable. Her father's talents are not your concern, Caedric said. Neither is she. The warning was delivered without inflection, without emphasis, without any of the theatrical menace that lesser men use to project authority. Caedric simply stated fact, and the fact restructured the social geometry of the conversation instantly. Fenwick retreated. Other nobles who had been drifting closer reversed course with the coordinated precision of a school of fish detecting a predator. Seraphina watched the retreat with an expression Caedric could not immediately classify. When she turned to him, there was something complicated in her eyes. Not gratitude, not resentment, but something that existed in the uncomfortable space between both. You protect your investments, she said quietly. I protect what I choose to protect. The motivation is irrelevant. The motivation is the only thing that is relevant. She held his gaze. Because investments are defended for profit. People are defended for reasons that have nothing to do with calculation, and I suspect you are no longer entirely certain which one you are doing. Caedric's chest tightened, not from anger, from the surgical precision of an observation that bypassed every defense he had constructed and landed directly against exposed nerve. He said nothing. He turned away and walked toward the balcony overlooking the palace gardens, where the air was cold enough to serve as a corrective against whatever was happening inside his ribcage. The Winter Ascension Ball began at sundown the following evening. The grand ballroom of the royal palace was a cathedral of excess. 12,000 candles burned from chandeliers suspended on chains thick as a man's wrist. The floor was polished marble inlaid with gold leaf patterns depicting the royal lineage stretching back 15 generations. Orchestras played from elevated galleries on 3 sides of the room, their music layered and complex, designed to create an acoustic environment that made private conversation nearly impossible without standing close enough to share breath. The nobility arrived in waves. Eastern lords, Southern merchants elevated by recent title purchases, military commanders whose dress uniforms bore campaign medals from wars fought on behalf of a crown they privately despised. The room filled with competing perfumes, strategic laughter, and the subsurface tension of several hundred people who understood that tonight's events would reshape political alliances for years. Caedric positioned himself near the western colonnade, his back to a marble pillar that eliminated approach from behind. Voss stood 12 feet to his left, close enough to respond, but far enough to maintain surveillance of the broader room. 6 Dravenmoor guards were distributed throughout the crowd in civilian dress, identified only by the small iron wolf pins on their collars. Seraphina stood beside Caedric. The midnight blue gown moved against the candlelight with a fluidity that drew attention from across the room, regardless of the wearer's intention. Her hair was pulled back from her face, exposing the strong line of her jaw and the steady dark eyes that refused to perform the docile femininity the court expected. King Matthias arrived last. He descended the grand staircase with the measured pace of a man acutely aware that his authority in this room was increasingly ceremonial. Prince Aldrich followed 2 steps behind, positioned close enough to project unity, far enough to maintain separation. His eyes found Caedric immediately. Then they found Seraphina, and stayed. Caedric tracked the prince's gaze with the reflexive precision of a man who had survived 11 years by reading threats before they materialized. Aldrich was not looking at Seraphina with desire. He was looking at her with satisfaction, the expression of someone confirming that a piece had arrived at the exact position on the board where it needed to be. "He is watching me," Seraphina said without turning her head. "He has been watching you since the reception. What does he want?" That is what we are about to find out. The ball progressed through its formal stages, the opening dances, the ceremonial toasts, the tedious speeches from minor lords competing for royal attention. Caedric endured each phase with visible impatience, his focus locked on the shifting political currents moving through the room like invisible weather systems. 90 minutes into the evening, Prince Aldrich made his approach. He crossed the ballroom floor alone, without guards, without entourage, a deliberate display of casual authority that Caedric recognized as performance. Aldrich was 31, lean, with the sharp features and restless intelligence of a man who compensated for his distance from the throne with superior strategic thinking. He wore the royal colors, but carried no sword, a choice that communicated either trust or contempt for the men around him. "Duke Dravenmoor." Aldrich's voice was calibrated for warmth that did not reach his eyes. "Your presence honors the crown, as always. Your invitation left little room for alternative. Mandatory attendance serves the kingdom's unity. Surely you appreciate the value of unity." "I appreciate the value of honest language. This is not about unity." Aldrich's smile held steady. He turned toward Seraphina with the practiced smoothness of a man redirecting a conversation to its actual subject. "Lady Vale, the last time we shared a room you were in chains. I trust Duke Dravenmoor has provided more comfortable accommodations." Seraphina met his gaze without flinching. "Comfortable enough? Though comfort and freedom are not synonyms, as I suspect you already know. Freedom is a complex concept in Valedorn." Aldrich's tone shifted, lighter, conspiratorial, as though inviting her into a shared understanding. particularly for those whose families have fallen from royal favor. Your father's case was unfortunate. Caedric felt the temperature change before the words landed. Not physical temperature, the atmospheric pressure of a conversation being steered toward dangerous terrain by someone who had rehearsed the approach. My father's case was murder, Seraphina said evenly. The word detonated silently in the space between the three of them. Nearby conversations continued, orchestras played, but in the small radius of this exchange, something fundamental had shifted. Aldrich's expression did not change. That was the tell. A man genuinely surprised by the accusation would have reacted: shock, anger, denial. Aldrich's perfect composure revealed that he had anticipated it, possibly engineered it. Strong words, Lady Vale. Aldrich glanced at Caedric. Your guardian permits such dangerous accusations? I do not manage her vocabulary, Caedric said coldly, and I would suggest you do not attempt to either. Of course. Aldrich stepped back with a gracious bow that concealed something calculated beneath its courtesy. Enjoy the evening, both of you. He retreated into the crowd, and within seconds was absorbed by a cluster of Eastern lords who received him with the eager deference of men who had already chosen their allegiance. Seraphina exhaled slowly. Her pulse was visible in her throat, rapid, controlled, the physical evidence of adrenaline being managed through deliberate stillness. He wanted me to say it, she murmured. Yes. He wanted witnesses to hear me accuse the crown of murder. Yes. That gives him justification to accuse you of continuing your father's treason, to present you before the court as proof that House Vale's disloyalty is hereditary, to use your words tonight as the foundation for formal charges. Caedric's voice was barely audible beneath the orchestral swell. He does not need evidence. He needs narrative, and you just gave him the opening line. Seraphina's face went pale, not with fear, with the sudden, devastating clarity of someone recognizing that they have been outmaneuvered by a mind that planned 3 moves ahead while she was still reacting to the first. Then we leave. Tonight. Leaving confirms guilt. The gates are already monitored. He anticipated flight. Then what do we do? Caedric turned to look at her. The candlelight caught the hard planes of his face, the jaw set like iron, the eyes carrying something that had destroyed men and families and entire political structures when it was directed with purpose. We do what Dravenmoors do when cornered, he said. We stop retreating and become the thing they should have been afraid of from the beginning. Across the ballroom, Prince Aldrich raised his glass toward the royal balcony, and the court herald began calling for silence. The trap was closing, and the only exit left ran straight through the center of it. The court herald's voice cut through the orchestral music like a blade separating tendon from bone. His Royal Highness Prince Aldrich requests the attention of the assembled nobility for a matter of urgent concern to the security of the kingdom of Valedorn. 12,000 candles continued burning. The chandeliers continued swaying in the thermal currents rising from hundreds of bodies packed into the grand ballroom. But the human sound, the laughter, the whispered negotiations, the performative courtesies, collapsed into a silence so total it had its own texture. Caedric's hand moved to his sword belt before his conscious mind registered the motion. Muscle memory encoded through 11 years of surviving environments exactly like this one. His gaze swept the room in a systematic grid: exits, guard positions, sight lines, the faces of men he recognized as Aldrich's known allies, and the faces of men whose allegiance he could not confirm. Seraphina stood close enough that he felt her breathing change. Faster, shallow. The physiology of a body preparing to fight or flee before the brain had decided which. Stay beside me, Caedric said without looking at her. Do not speak unless I tell you to. I am not a child who needs... You are a target standing in an open room surrounded by people who want you either dead or discredited. And right now, the man who orchestrated this evening is about to address the court with you as the subject. Stay beside me. Do not speak. She stayed. Prince Aldrich ascended the 3 steps to the royal platform with the relaxed stride of a man who had already calculated the outcome of the next 30 minutes and found it satisfactory. He positioned himself to the right of the king's throne, not on it, not behind it, but beside it, occupying the specific geography of power that communicated authority without technically claiming the crown. King Matthias watched his brother with an expression that Caedric recognized instantly. The expression of a man who had been informed of the plan but not consulted on it. The king's hands gripped the armrests of his throne with the tension of someone holding on to relevance while it eroded beneath him in real time. "My lords and ladies," Aldrich began. His voice was engineered for rooms like this, warm enough to project sincerity, sharp enough to command attention, modulated with the precision of someone who understood that persuasion was not about content but about rhythm. This evening was meant to celebrate the unity of Valedorn, the bonds that hold our great houses together, the trust that sustains our kingdom. The word trust landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Caedric tracked the ripples, which faces tightened, which remained neutral, which displayed the rehearsed concern of men who already knew what was coming. Lord Fenwick, Lord Heron, Count Braemar of the southern provinces. 3 men positioned at separate points around the ballroom, each one watching Aldrich with the synchronized attention of actors waiting for their cue. 3 men Caedric had classified as minor irritants. He reclassified them instantly. "But trust," Aldrich continued, his gaze sweeping the room with theatrical gravity, "requires vigilance, and tonight I must bring before this court evidence that the conspiracy which took Duke Aldrin Vale's life did not die with him." The murmur that rolled through the ballroom was not surprise. It was the sound of an audience arriving at the scene they had been promised. Half the room had been prepped. Caedric understood it now with the clinical clarity of a man watching a machine operate. Every conversation at the reception, every carefully placed rumor, every strategic glance exchanged between Aldrich's allies over the past 24 hours had been lubrication for this moment. He had been out-prepared. The realization hit Caedric like cold water. Not the fact of the ambush. He had anticipated an ambush. But the scale, the depth of coordination, the number of moving pieces that had been positioned over weeks or months while he sat in Blackthorn Keep, focused on mining contracts and military deployments, and the woman standing beside him who consumed more of his attention than any strategic threat should have been permitted to consume. Aldrich gestured toward a side chamber, and 2 court officials emerged carrying a wooden case. They placed it on a table before the royal platform and opened the lid to reveal a stack of documents bound in leather. "Letters," Aldrich announced, "recovered from a hidden vault in the former Vale estate, written in Duke Aldrin Vale's own hand. Correspondence with agents of the Meridian Confederacy detailing military positions, trade routes, and defensive vulnerabilities of the Northern Territories." Seraphina's body went rigid beside Caedric, not with fear, with rage so compressed it changed the quality of the air around her. "Those are forgeries," she said. Her voice carried further than she intended. Heads turned. Aldrich's expression shifted into something resembling sympathy. "Lady Vale, I understand the pain of learning that a parent's legacy is not what we believed, but the evidence speaks clearly. The evidence speaks whatever language you wrote it in." The room held its breath. Caedric placed his hand on Seraphina's arm, not gently, not roughly, but with the deliberate pressure of a physical command that communicated stop through contact rather than words. She stopped. Aldrich allowed the silence to settle before continuing. "Furthermore, these letters reference ongoing communication with an unnamed contact inside Valedorn, someone who continued Duke Vale's work after his execution, someone who maintained the intelligence pipeline to our enemies." Another gesture. Another official stepped forward, this one carrying a single document sealed with wax. "A sworn affidavit," Aldrich said, "from a member of Duke Dravenmoor's own household, confirming that Lady Seraphina Vale has been observed conducting private correspondence with foreign agents during her residence at Blackthorn Keep." The bottom fell out of Caedric's strategic assessment. Not because of the accusation against Seraphina, he had anticipated that. Not because of the forged letters, he had anticipated those too. Because of the source, a member of his own household. Caedric's mind executed a rapid inventory of every person inside Blackthorn Keep with access to information about Seraphina's daily activities. The list was short. He had designed it to be short. Voss, the tower guards, the kitchen staff who delivered her meals, and Marin Ashford, who managed every logistical detail of the fortress and reported directly to Caedric on all matters relating to the household. Marin, who had served the Dravenmoor estate for 11 years. Marin, who had been present during every council session Seraphina attended. Marin, who had personally overseen the arrangement of quarters, the assignment of servants, the management of correspondence flowing in and out of the fortress. Marin, whose loyalty Caedric had never questioned because questioning it would have required acknowledging that the architecture of trust he had built his governance upon might contain structural flaws. "Bring the witness," Aldrich commanded. The side door opened and Marin Ashford walked into the ballroom. She wore clothing Caedric had never seen her in, a formal gown in neutral gray, her hair arranged differently, her posture altered from the rigid efficiency of a steward to the deliberate composure of someone presenting herself as a concerned citizen of the realm. She had been dressed for this. Prepared. Rehearsed. The distance between the side door and the royal platform was approximately 40 feet. Marin crossed it without looking at Caedric. Not once. Not a glance. Not a flicker of eye contact. Not the involuntary micro-expression of guilt that most people could not suppress when facing someone they had betrayed. She did not look at him because she had already decided, long before this moment, that the man she had served for 11 years was no longer the side of the equation she intended to stand on. Caedric's chest filled with something he had not experienced since the night his father died. Not anger. Anger was familiar, manageable, a fuel source he had refined into a clean-burning instrument of action. This was something older and less useful. The specific sensation of discovering that the foundation you built your life on contained a fracture that had been spreading silently for years while you walked over it every day, believing the ground was solid. Voss materialized at his shoulder. "My lord, I see her. Do you want me to—" "No." Caedric's voice was barely audible. "Not yet." Marin reached the platform. She turned to face the court, and for the first time her gaze swept across the room and passed over Caedric's position with the indifference of someone cataloging furniture. "Steward Ashford," Aldrich began with practiced gentleness, "you have served House Dravenmoor faithfully for many years." 11 years, Your Highness. "And during that time you have managed the daily operations of Blackthorn Keep, including oversight of all residents and guests." "That is correct." "Including Lady Seraphina Vale, who has resided at the keep for the past 2 months under Duke Dravenmoor's guardianship." "Yes." Aldrich paused for effect. The ballroom was so silent that the candle flames could be heard hissing in their own wax. "During Lady Vale's residence, did you observe any behavior that concerned you?" Marin's expression arranged itself into the careful architecture of reluctant honesty. "I did, Your Highness. Lady Vale was permitted unusual freedom of movement within the fortress. She attended council meetings. She had access to military correspondence and strategic documents. And on 3 occasions, I observed her writing letters that were not submitted through the standard household correspondence system." "Letters to whom?" "I was unable to determine the recipients. The letters were given to a servant who departed through the coastal supply gate. I reported my concerns to Duke Dravenmoor." Aldrich's eyebrows rose with theatrical precision. "And what was his response?" "He dismissed my concerns." Marin's voice carried the calibrated disappointment of a loyal servant forced to testify against her master. "He instructed me to leave Lady Vale's activities unmonitored." The court erupted. Not in shock, in the performance of shock. The prepared half of the room reacted with gasps and murmured outrage, while the unprepared half scrambled to calculate the implications. King Matthias leaned forward on his throne with the expression of a man watching a fire spread toward structures he could not afford to lose. Caedric stood absolutely still. His mind was operating on 2 parallel tracks. The strategic track was already mapping the architecture of the conspiracy. Aldrich had spent months constructing this. Marin had been turned, recruited, bribed, threatened, or ideologically converted at some point during the past year, possibly longer. The forged letters were manufactured evidence. The affidavit was scripted testimony. The entire evening was theater designed to achieve a specific political outcome: the public destruction of Duke Dravenmoor's credibility, the arrest of Seraphina Vale, and the establishment of Prince Aldrich as the kingdom's defender against a manufactured threat. The other track, the one running beneath the strategic calculations like an underground river, was processing something that had no military application and no political utility. Merrin had eaten at his table. She had managed his household through 2 attempted assassinations, a border war, and the grinding daily machinery of governing a territory that would collapse without competent administration. She had been the first person to enter his study each morning and the last to leave each night. She knew the schedules, the vulnerabilities, the private habits, the unguarded moments that occurred between formal duties when the architecture of control relaxed fractionally and the man behind it became briefly visible. She had seen him, and she had used what she saw to determine the precise angle of attack that would cause maximum damage. Being known. Seraphina's diagnosis echoed through his skull with the precision of a blade finding the gap between armor plates, the fear of transparency, the terror of being seen. And here was the proof that the fear had always been rational, because the person who knew him best had just weaponized that knowledge in front of the entire aristocracy. Something shifted inside Caedric's chest. Not broke. Shifted. The way tectonic plates shift before the surface cracks. A deep, structural rearrangement that would take time to reach the exterior, but had already altered the fundamental geology beneath. Aldrich was speaking again. The words reached Caedric through the filter of his recalibration, slightly delayed, like sound arriving after the event that produced it. Given the severity of these revelations, I formally request that the court order Lady Seraphina Vale's immediate detention pending a full investigation into her involvement in her father's conspiracy. And I further request that Duke Dravenmoor's judgment be formally reviewed, given his apparent willingness to compromise kingdom security on behalf of a known traitor's daughter. The king looked at Caedric. The entire court looked at Caedric. 400 pairs of eyes fixed on the man who had ruled the northern territories through fear, calculation, and the absolute refusal to display weakness under any circumstances. Seraphina's hand found his arm. Her fingers pressed against the fabric of his coat with a pressure that communicated something language could not. The raw, physical urgency of a person standing beside someone at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether they were about to jump or be pushed. Caedric. The first time she had used his name without his title. Whatever you do next decides everything. He knew. He had known since Merrin walked through that door. The political calculus was binary. Option 1, sacrifice Seraphina. Allow the arrest. Denounce her publicly. Preserve his position, his territory, his power. The strategic choice. The survivable choice. The choice that the man he had been for 11 years would make without hesitation, because sentiment was leverage, and leverage was what got you killed. Option 2. Defy the court. Protect the woman. Destroy the political architecture that had kept him untouchable for over a decade. Start a war he might not win against a conspiracy whose full dimensions he could not yet see. Option 1 preserved everything he had built. Option 2 preserved the one thing he had not yet understood he was building toward. Caedric stepped forward. The crowd parted. Not because he moved with particular speed or aggression, because the energy radiating from his body had changed frequency. The calculated coldness that had defined him for a decade was gone. What replaced it was something the court had never seen from the Duke of Dravenmoor. Something that did not calculate odds or measure consequences or strategize outcomes. Something that had stopped negotiating with the situation and started responding to it with the raw, ungoverned force of a man who had just discovered that the cage he built to protect himself had also been preventing him from becoming whatever came next. "Merrin," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The acoustics of the ballroom carried it to every corner. Merrin looked at him for the first time. And in her eyes, Caedric saw the one thing she had not been able to rehearse, a flash of genuine fear. Not because she doubted the plan, because she recognized the man standing before her was not the man she had calculated for. 11 years, Caedric said. You managed my household. You knew my schedules, my correspondence, my military deployments. You knew when I slept and when I woke. You knew which corridors I walked at night when the fortress was quiet. Merrin's composure held, but the muscles along her jaw tightened. And in all that time, you never once asked yourself what happens when you betray a man who already expects betrayal from everyone except the people he trusts. My lord, my duty is to the kingdom. Your duty was to me. The words came out stripped of decoration, raw as an open wound. And you fulfilled it faithfully for 11 years, which means one of two things. Either you were compromised recently, in which case Aldrich threatened or purchased you, and every word you spoke tonight was scripted, or you were placed inside my household from the beginning, which means your entire career was a long-term intelligence operation. Marin's silence answered the question she refused to speak. Aldrich stepped forward. Duke Dravenmoor, these emotional outbursts are beneath the dignity of— Sit down. Caedric did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The command carried the weight of a man who had destroyed noble houses with less provocation than what he was experiencing now. You have orchestrated a public trial based on forged documents and purchased testimony from a compromised member of my household. The letters are fabrications. The correspondence Marin described never existed, and the conspiracy you are attempting to expose is not Seraphina Vale's, it is yours. The ballroom went completely still. Aldrich's expression hardened. The warmth evaporated from his performance, and underneath it emerged the cold, efficient mind that had been running these operations for years. Bold accusations from a man who just admitted emotional attachment to a traitor's daughter. Your judgment is compromised, Dravenmoor. The court sees it. The king sees it. The court sees what you staged for them. The king sees what you permit him to see. Caedric turned toward Matthias. Your Majesty, Duke Aldrin Vale was not a traitor. He was murdered because he discovered that weapons from Valedorn's own armories were being diverted to the Meridian Confederacy through channels controlled by someone inside the royal court. The silence that followed was different from the silences before. This one had teeth. King Matthias stared at Caedric with an expression that combined confusion, fear, and the desperate political calculation of a man realizing that the ground beneath his throne was considerably less stable than he had believed. Aldrich recovered fast. Faster than Caedric expected. Conspiracy theories from a besotted duke. The court requires evidence, not accusations driven by infatuation. Evidence. Caedric reached inside his coat and produced a leather document case. He had carried it from Blackthorn Keep. He had carried it every day since claiming Seraphina at the tribunal, because the information inside it was the reason he had claimed her in the first place. Shipping manifests from the northern ports, he said, documented by my harbor masters over the past 18 months. Weapons-grade iron leaving Valedorn through intermediary merchants whose trading licenses were issued by the Royal Chancellery, specifically by the Office of the Prince's Economic Council. He placed the documents on the table beside the forged letters. Your forgeries against her father. My evidence against you. The court can compare handwriting, seals, and authorization signatures at its leisure. Prince Aldrich's composure cracked. It was a small fracture, a tightening of the muscles around his eyes, a micro-shift in his weight distribution from confident stance to defensive posture. But in a room full of predators trained to detect weakness, it was a signal fire visible from miles away. Aldrich turned towards the guards positioned around the ballroom. Arrest them both. The Duke is clearly involved in the Vale conspiracy. Seize the documents. Touch those documents, Caedric said, and his hand closed around his sword hilt with a grip that made the leather creak. And discover what happens when you corner a man who has nothing left to calculate. The guards hesitated, not because they feared Caedric more than the prince, because they recognized the specific quality of stillness in his body. The absolute committed stillness of a man who had crossed the line between strategic violence and something far more dangerous. A man who had stopped weighing outcomes and started operating on pure, refined will. From behind him, Seraphina's voice cut through the tension. The servant Marin mentioned, the one who supposedly carried my letters through the coastal gate. His name was Terran. He was found dead in the Thornwood 6 weeks ago, throat cut. I was told it was bandits. Every eye moved to Marin. The steward's face drained of color, not from the accusation itself, but from the surgical precision of its delivery. A dead witness could not be cross-examined. A dead witness whose death could be connected to the people who manufactured his testimony transformed the narrative from treason into murder. You needed him to corroborate your story tonight, Seraphina continued, her voice carrying the controlled fury of a woman who had been processing the architecture of her own destruction for months without revealing that she understood every beam and joint. But dead men are unreliable witnesses. So you built the case on Marin alone, and Marin's testimony is the word of a single compromised operative against the documented evidence of Northern Port manifests signed by the prince's own officials. Aldrich's jaw locked. His gaze moved between Caedric and Seraphina with the frantic calculation of a man watching his carefully constructed machine malfunction in real time. "Guards!" he commanded again, louder this time, the desperation audible. King Matthias stood. The room froze. "Enough!" The king's voice was thin, but carried the residual authority of a crown that still technically governed. This court will not conduct arrests based on contested evidence. The documents presented by both parties will be submitted to the royal tribunal for examination. Until that examination is complete, all parties will remain under the protection of the crown. "Your Majesty," Aldrich began, "I said enough." Matthias turned to his brother with an expression that had hardened from confusion into something colder. "You brought this matter before the court, Aldrich. You will submit to the court's process, unless you believe yourself above it." The question hung in the air like a blade suspended by a thread. Aldrich swallowed. He stepped back. He nodded with the mechanical compliance of a man retreating to regroup rather than surrendering. "Of course, Your Majesty." But his eyes found Caedric across the ballroom one final time, and what Caedric read in them was not defeat, it was recalculation. The look of a strategist who had lost a battle and was already designing the next campaign. Caedric turned and walked toward the exit with Seraphina beside him, Voss closing ranks behind them, the Dravenmoor guards converging from their positions throughout the crowd in a coordinated extraction that moved with the fluid precision of a military retreat. They were 30 feet from the ballroom doors when Voss leaned forward. "We have a problem." "We have several." "One is immediate. I sent 2 men to check the sealed passage behind the tapestry hall when the hearing began. They have not reported back." Caedric's stride did not change. His breathing did not change. But his hand returned to his sword hilt with the practiced fluidity of a man transitioning from political warfare to the physical variety without breaking step. "How many men does Aldrich have inside the palace?" "More than he showed us tonight. He planned for this to end with an arrest. When the arrest failed, he needs a contingency." "Which is?" They reached the corridor outside the ballroom. The passage stretched ahead of them, marble floors, tapestried walls, iron sconces casting pools of amber light separated by long intervals of shadow. The eastern wing quarters were a 7-minute walk through 4 separate corridor junctions. From somewhere ahead, metal scraped against stone. The unmistakable sound of armored men repositioning. Voss drew his sword. "Contingency," he said. Caedric drew his own blade. The steel caught the torchlight and held it, a cold, clean line of reflected fire running the length of the weapon. He looked at Seraphina. She stood between 2 armed men in a palace corridor that was rapidly transforming from a diplomatic environment into a kill zone, and her expression carried neither panic nor paralysis. She was reading the situation the way she read everything else, systematically, rapidly, with the brutal efficiency of a woman who had already survived the destruction of her entire family and understood exactly what survival required. "I need a weapon," she said. Caedric reached to his belt and handed her a short blade without hesitation. Their fingers touched during the transfer. The contact lasted less than a second, but something passed through it, a current of shared understanding that transcended the political, the strategic, and the personal. They were past the point where roles mattered, past the point where power dynamics held meaning, past the point where the question of who owned whom had any relevance to 2 people standing in a corridor with armed men approaching from the darkness. All that remained was the ancient, irreducible equation: survive together or die apart. From the shadows ahead, armored figures emerged, and behind them, the ballroom doors sealed shut with the heavy, final sound of iron meeting stone. 6 armored men stepped out of the shadows. They moved in a staggered formation, 2 forward, 2 flanking, 2 holding the corridor's width behind them to block retreat. Professional spacing, coordinated sight lines, not palace guards pulling double duty as political enforcers. These were trained killers wearing royal insignia over combat-grade plate armor, and the way they held their swords told Caedric everything he needed to know about their orders. No arrest, no escort, no diplomatic pretense. Elimination. Caedric's body shifted before his mind finished the assessment. 11 years of governing through violence had welded instinct to action so tightly that the gap between recognition and response had been compressed into something almost molecular. His sword came up into a high guard. His weight dropped into his back leg. His breathing slowed to the deep, controlled rhythm that fed oxygen to muscle without wasting it on fear. Voss moved simultaneously, positioning himself to Caedric's left, his blade angled to cover the flank approach. Behind them, Seraphina pressed her back against the corridor wall and held the short blade Caedric had given her with a grip that was technically imperfect but functionally committed. 6 visible, Voss said through his teeth. Assume more behind the intersection. Assume more everywhere. The first 2 attackers closed the distance with disciplined aggression. No battle cries. No threats. Just the efficient forward movement of men who had been paid to produce corpses. Not theater. Caedric met the lead attacker 3 steps ahead of Seraphina's position. The collision of steel on steel produced a sound that ricocheted off the marble walls and multiplied into a cascade of metallic echoes that filled the corridor like something alive. The impact traveled up Caedric's arms and into his shoulders. The man was strong, well-trained, and completely irrelevant, because strength and training meant nothing against a man who had decided that dying in this corridor was acceptable as long as the woman behind him was still breathing when it was over. Caedric deflected the second strike, stepped inside the attacker's guard, and drove his elbow into the man's throat with enough force to collapse the windpipe. The soldier dropped. Not gracefully, not dramatically. He simply stopped being a threat and became an obstacle on the floor that the next attacker had to step over. That half-second delay was all Caedric needed. He pivoted, caught the second man's sword on his own blade, and redirected the force into the wall. The attacker's weapon struck marble, and the vibration loosened his grip. Caedric did not give him time to recover. The counterstrike was precise and final. 2 down. Voss engaged the flanking pair with the controlled ferocity of a career soldier who had survived more corridor fights than most men survived formal duels. His technique was different from Caedric's. Less precise, more brutal, designed to overwhelm through relentless forward pressure rather than surgical timing. He fought the way he spoke. Direct, efficient, without ornament. The remaining 2 attackers at the rear of the formation did not advance. They held their position at the corridor intersection, and Caedric understood why immediately. They were not the second wave. They were the net. Their job was to ensure that no one who entered this corridor left it. Voss, the intersection. I see them. Can you hold here? Go. Caedric moved past the fallen bodies with the controlled speed of a man navigating terrain he could not afford to misstep on. Blood on marble was treacherous, a detail most people learned theoretically, and Caedric had learned by nearly dying on a slick floor during his first real combat engagement at 24. He placed his feet deliberately, each step calculated, each breath measured against the exertion budget his body could sustain before fatigue degraded his precision. The 2 rear guards separated as he approached, widening the gap between them to force him into engaging one while exposing his flank to the other. Standard corridor doctrine. The counter was simple in theory and brutal in execution. Commit fully to one target fast enough that the second could not capitalize on the opening. Caedric committed. He drove into the left side guard with an overhead strike that carried his full body weight. The man parried, but the force buckled his stance. Caedric followed with a low kick to the knee that hyperextended the joint and dropped the soldier to one side. The right side guard lunged. Caedric felt the blade slice across his left arm. Not deep, but the pain registered like a line of fire drawn from elbow to wrist, and the warm, wet spread of blood inside his sleeve altered the coefficient of grip on his sword handle. He adjusted, tightened his fingers, absorbed the pain into the architecture of his concentration, rather than allowing it to fragment his focus. Pain was information. It told him the wound was superficial. It told him his tendons were intact. It told him he had approximately 30 minutes before blood loss became a factor if the bleeding was not controlled. He killed the right side guard with a thrust that found the gap between breastplate and shoulder armor. The man fell against the wall and slid down it with the slow, graceless descent of a body, losing the ability to support its own weight. The corridor was clear, temporarily. Voss finished behind him and caught up, breathing hard. Blood that was not his own streaked his face. His sword arm showed the controlled tremor of a muscle group that had been pushed to its operational limit. "More coming," Voss said. "I heard boots on the level below. They are moving through the servants' passages." "How many?" "Enough to make the next fight considerably less favorable." Seraphina appeared between them, the short blade still in her hand, her face pale, but her eyes burning with the focused intensity of a person who had crossed the threshold between civilian and combatant somewhere in the last 90 seconds and was not going back. "The eastern wing is cut off," she said. "If they have men in the servants' passages, they control every route to your quarters." "We are not going to the quarters." Seraphina looked at him sharply. "Then where?" Caedric's mind was running on the cold, crystalline fuel that replaced adrenaline when a man had been in enough desperate situations to burn through the initial chemical response and access the layer beneath it. The layer where fear stopped being an obstacle and became data. Where the narrowing of options produced not paralysis but clarity. The specific diamond-hard clarity of a man who understood that the fewer choices remaining, the easier the decision became. "The throne room," he said. Voss stared at him. "The throne room is at the center of the palace. We would have to cross 3 defended corridors, 2 open courtyards, and the grand gallery." "Yes." "With 3 people, one of whom is wounded. I am aware of the mathematics. The mathematics say we die. The mathematics say we die in this corridor too. The difference is that dying in a corridor produces no witnesses, no political consequence, and no narrative. Dying in the throne room produces all 3. Caedric wrapped a strip of fabric torn from his coat sleeve around the wound on his left arm and pulled it tight with his teeth. Aldrich planned this as an assassination disguised as a political arrest. If we die in a hallway, the official story is that we resisted detention and were killed in the process. If we reach the throne room, we die in front of the court, in front of the king, in front of every noble house in Valedorn, and Aldrich cannot control the narrative of a public execution he did not authorize. Voss processed this. The soldier in him fought the logic. The strategist in him recognized it. "You are betting that reaching the throne room alive forces Aldrich to either let us live or murder us in front of witnesses. I am betting that a man who has spent years constructing a political conspiracy will not destroy it by committing an act of open violence that even his allies cannot rationalize. And if you are wrong," Caedric met his captain's eyes, "then we die in a room worthy of the effort." They moved. The palace corridors transformed from architecture into topography, terrain to be assessed, traversed, and survived. Caedric led with Seraphina between himself and Voss, maintaining a pace that balanced speed against caution. Every intersection was a potential ambush point. Every doorway was a possible breach. The ornamental alcoves that held marble statues and decorative armor became concealment positions that had to be checked and cleared. The first courtyard was empty. Moonlight flooded the open space, turning the decorative fountains into silver silhouettes and the manicured hedges into black geometric masses. Their footsteps on the courtyard stones were the loudest sound in the world. Halfway across, Seraphina spoke. "He killed my father." Caedric did not slow his pace. "I know. You knew before you claimed me at the tribunal." "Yes." "You knew Aldrich orchestrated the treason charges, manufactured the evidence, and had my father executed to bury the weapons trafficking. You knew all of it, and you took me to Blackthorn Keep not because of the debt, not because of possession, because you needed me alive long enough to build a case against him." "Yes." The word landed between them with the weight of every lie of omission Caedric had committed over the past 2 months. Every time he had allowed her to believe she was property rather than protection. Every confrontation he had permitted to continue because telling her the truth would have required explaining that the man who claimed to own her had actually been standing between her and the people trying to kill her from the moment the gavel fell at the tribunal. Seraphina's stride did not falter, but her voice changed. The controlled fury that had sustained her through the ball, through the corridor fight, through the systematic destruction of everything she believed about her situation, it cracked, just slightly. Just enough to reveal something underneath that was not anger, but grief. The grief of a woman who had spent months hating a man for the wrong reasons, and was now discovering that the right reasons were infinitely more complicated. You could have told me. You would not have stayed. You do not know that. I know that a woman whose father was murdered does not willingly place her safety in the hands of a man she does not trust, and I could not afford to give you the choice, because the choice included the possibility of you choosing wrong. That was not your decision to make. Every decision that keeps you alive is mine to make. The words came out raw, stripped of the political calculation and strategic framing that Caedric used as insulation between his actual thoughts and the world that received them. That is not philosophy. That is not possession. That is the only commitment I have made in 11 years that has nothing to do with territory or power or the architecture of control. You survive. Everything else is negotiable. They reached the second corridor. Two of Aldrich's men were positioned at the far end, alerted by the courtyard crossing. Caedric hit them before they finished drawing weapons. The first engagement lasted 4 seconds. The second lasted 3. Speed compensated for the fatigue settling into his muscles like sediment, the accumulating weight of sustained combat that no amount of training could indefinitely postpone. His wounded arm was weakening. The makeshift bandage had slowed the bleeding but not stopped it, and each swing sent a pulse of sharp, specific pain from the wound site to his shoulder that he had to metabolize through willpower rather than ignore. Men who ignore pain eventually make the mistake of forgetting it exists. Men who metabolize it convert it into a reminder of exactly how much they have invested in surviving the next 30 seconds. The grand gallery stretched before them, a 100-foot corridor lined with portraits of Valedorn's royal lineage, illuminated by iron candelabras mounted between each painting. The floor was polished stone, the ceiling vaulted high enough to create acoustic amplification that would announce their presence to anyone within 200 feet. It was also occupied. 12 soldiers in royal combat armor stood in a defensive line across the gallery's midpoint, blocking access to the throne room beyond. These were not the assassination squad from the corridor. These were palace regulars, professional soldiers following orders they may or may not have fully understood, positioned by a chain of command that Aldrich had subverted through his authority as the prince. Voss stopped. 12. I can count. Caedric. Voss used his name, the first time in years. The familiarity carried weight, the weight of a man who had served another man long enough to earn the right to be honest when honesty was the last thing either of them wanted to hear. 12 armored soldiers in a fortified position. 3 of us. 1 wounded, 1 civilian. The mathematics have not improved. Caedric studied the formation. His mind processed variables with the mechanical efficiency of a system designed for exactly this kind of pressure, the kind that crushed men who relied on emotion and sharpened men who had learned to convert emotion into fuel. These soldiers were following orders. They were not Aldrich's personal assassins. They were palace guards redirected through the command structure, which meant they operated on institutional loyalty, not personal commitment. Institutional loyalty had a structural weakness that personal commitment did not. It could be challenged by higher authority. Hold position, Caedric told Voss and Seraphina. He sheathed his sword. Voss inhaled sharply. What are you doing? Something considerably more dangerous than fighting. Caedric walked forward into the gallery alone, unarmed, bleeding through his left sleeve. His boots struck the polished stone with a measured cadence that echoed between the portraits of dead kings like a pulse. He did not walk fast. He did not walk slow. He walked with the specific deliberation of a man who had decided that the next 60 seconds would determine whether he lived or died and had chosen to spend them demonstrating that the distinction did not govern his behavior. The soldiers watched him approach. 12 men in armor, gripping weapons, trained to respond to threats with coordinated lethal force. And approaching them was a single bleeding man with empty hands and the expression of someone who had stopped being afraid so completely that the absence of fear itself became the most threatening thing in the room. Caedric stopped 10 feet from the line. Who commands this detail? A sergeant stepped forward. Mid-40s, career soldier, the face of a man who followed orders because following orders was the architecture his entire identity was built upon. Sergeant Bren, my lord. Palace Guard, 3rd Regiment. Sergeant Bren, you have been ordered to hold this gallery against unauthorized passage to the throne room. That is correct, my lord. Who issued the order? Bren hesitated. The hesitation told Caedric everything. A soldier confident in the legitimacy of his orders does not hesitate when asked to name the authority behind them. The order came through the palace command chain, my lord. Through the command chain, not from the king directly. The king's authority is delegated through. The king's authority is the king's authority. Everything else is someone borrowing it. Caedric took one step closer. Sergeant, I am Duke Caedric Dravenmoor. I fund 30% of the crown's military operations. My iron mines supply the weapons your men are currently pointing at my chest. And I am telling you, as someone who has spent 11 years ensuring that soldiers like you receive pay, equipment, and the institutional support that keeps your families fed, that the order you are following tonight did not originate from the king. Bren's grip tightened on his sword. The men behind him shifted, not aggressively, uncertainly. The specific uncertainty of professional soldiers whose training prepared them for combat, but not for the moment when the chain of command itself became the contested territory. It came from Prince Aldrich, Caedric continued, who is currently in the ballroom, attempting to consolidate a political coup that involves the assassination of a duke, the arrest of an innocent woman, and the systematic corruption of the royal military apparatus you have spent your career serving. You are not defending the throne tonight, Sergeant. You are being used as a barrier between a traitor and the consequences of his treason. Silence. The candelabras hissed. The portraits of dead kings stared down from their frames with the painted indifference of men who had survived their own political crises or been destroyed by them, their expressions frozen at the moment the artist decided to stop adding brushstrokes. Sergeant Bren looked at the bleeding man standing in front of 12 armed soldiers with empty hands and a voice that carried the weight of a territory that could financially destroy the entire palace guard apparatus if sufficiently provoked. "Stand down," Bren said. 3 soldiers broke formation, then 5, then the rest. They parted like a wall developing a crack, slowly at first, then with the accelerating inevitability of structural failure. Bren stepped aside and lowered his sword, and the gallery opened like a throat releasing a held breath. Caedric walked through. Voss and Seraphina followed. As they passed the soldiers, Seraphina glanced at Caedric's face and saw something she had not seen before. Not triumph, not satisfaction, exhaustion. The deep, corrosive exhaustion of a man who had been holding an empire together through force of will for over a decade and had just spent the last reserves of that force on a gamble that worked only because the alternative was dying on a polished floor, surrounded by portraits of men who had failed the same test. The throne room doors stood before them. Massive oak reinforced with iron bands, carved with the royal crest, flanked by 2 ceremonial guards who took one look at the bleeding duke, the armed captain, and the woman carrying a blade, and stepped aside without requiring the conversation. Caedric pushed the doors open. The throne room was not empty. King Matthias sat on the throne, attended by 4 royal advisors and a contingent of palace officials who had clearly been roused from the ball by reports of violence in the corridors. The king's face bore the strained expression of a man watching his kingdom's political machinery malfunction in real time while lacking the tools to repair it. And standing before the throne, mid-sentence, mid-argument, mid-performance of outraged concern for the crown's security, was Prince Aldrich. He turned when the doors opened. The expression that crossed his face when he saw Caedric standing in the doorway, alive, bleeding, sword-sheathed, but radiating the specific energy of a man who had fought through his entire security apparatus to reach this room, was the first genuine emotion Caedric had ever witnessed on the prince's carefully managed features. It was terror. "Your Majesty," Caedric said, and his voice filled the throne room with the authority of a man who had earned the right to speak in this chamber through blood, iron, and the 11 years of brutal governance that had kept the northern territories from collapsing into the chaos that would have consumed the crown along with them. "Your brother just attempted to have me and Lady Vale assassinated in your corridors. 6 men in the eastern wing, 2 more near the Grand Gallery, all wearing royal insignia, all operating on orders issued through your brother's command authority." He walked forward. Blood dripped from his left hand onto the marble floor, marking each step with a small crimson period. The weapons trafficking that killed Duke Aldrin Vale, the forged treason charges, the corrupted testimony from my own steward. and now an assassination attempt inside the royal palace during a mandatory court function. Caedric stopped in front of the throne and looked up at the king with the eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. This ends tonight. Either your brother answers for what he has done, or I tear this kingdom apart, finding everyone who helped him do it. King Matthias stared at his brother. Prince Aldrich stared at Caedric. And Seraphina, standing in the doorway of the throne room with blood on her hands and a blade she had not lowered, watched the two most powerful men in Valedorn lock onto each other across 15 feet of marble floor while the kingdom's future balanced on the edge of whatever happened next. Then Aldrich moved, not toward the door, not toward the king, toward Seraphina. He lunged with the desperate velocity of a man whose entire political architecture had collapsed in the span of a single evening and who had identified, with the clarity that only total strategic failure produces, that the one remaining move available to him was the destruction of the person whose survival had made his defeat possible. A blade appeared in his hand, palace ceremonial steel, thin and fast. Caedric was 15 feet away. Too far. He ran anyway. 15 feet collapsed into 10, then 5, then nothing. Caedric's body covered the distance with a velocity that exceeded what his wounded frame should have been capable of producing. His legs drove into the marble floor with the desperate force of a man whose entire existence had narrowed to a single geometric calculation. The angle between Aldrich's blade and Seraphina's body, the closing speed of the ceremonial steel, the diminishing margin measured in fractions of a second that separated survival from the one outcome his fortress, his army, his empire, and every instrument of power he had accumulated over 11 years could not reverse. Seraphina saw the blade coming. She raised the short knife Caedric had given her in the corridor. An instinctive motion, unrefined, the response of a body that had never trained for combat but understood at a cellular level that passivity in this moment meant death. Her blade caught Aldrich's thrust at an imperfect angle and deflected it partially. The ceremonial steel slid along the shorter weapon and continued its trajectory toward her ribcage with diminished but still lethal force. Caedric's hand closed around the blade. Not the handle. The blade itself. His left hand, already wounded, already wrapped in blood-soaked fabric, seized the steel between Aldrich's grip and Seraphina's body. The edge cut through the makeshift bandage, through skin, through the tissue beneath, and stopped against the bones of his palm with a sensation that Caedric experienced not as pain, but as arrival. The final cost of a journey that had begun the night he claimed a dead traitor's daughter before the entire aristocracy, and every step since had been leading toward this specific moment where the architecture of control he had built his life around was replaced by something infinitely simpler and infinitely more expensive. Blood ran down his forearm in heavy streams. His fingers locked around the blade with a grip powered by something beyond muscle, the compressed force of a man who had discovered, at the precise intersection of violence and sacrifice, that the walls he built to prevent himself from being destroyed had also prevented him from being capable of this. This act, this choice, this willing exchange of his own body for someone else's survival that required tearing down every structural barrier between who he was and who he had refused to become. Aldrich's eyes widened. The prince pulled at the trapped blade. It did not move. Caedric's grip held with the absolute, irrational commitment of a man who had stopped calculating and started choosing. Caedric's right hand drew his sword. The motion was fluid despite the damage to his body, despite the blood loss, despite the exhaustion that had been accumulating since the corridor fight like debt, compounding against a diminishing account. One clean arc. The blade traveled the short distance between Caedric's hip and Aldrich's chest with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the mechanics of lethal force and was now deploying them with the cold terminal finality that the moment required. The sword entered below the prince's sternum. Aldrich's grip on his own blade released. His hands dropped to the steel protruding from his body. His face cycled through a rapid sequence of expressions: shock, confusion, the brief flash of indignation that accompanies the realization that power does not make a man invulnerable, and finally something that looked almost like understanding. The understanding of a man confronting the consequence he had spent years engineering for others but never genuinely believed would arrive for himself. "You," Aldrich managed. The word came out wet, damaged. For her. Caedric pulled the blade free. Aldrich collapsed. The throne room went silent with the absolute devastating totality of a space that has just witnessed an event that cannot be undone, cannot be reframed, cannot be absorbed into the existing political vocabulary without fundamentally restructuring everything it describes. Prince Aldrich lay on the marble floor of the royal palace, bleeding from a wound inflicted by the Duke of Dravenmoor, in front of the king, 4 royal advisors, a contingent of palace officials, and the woman whose survival had cost the prince his life, and the Duke everything he had spent 11 years constructing. King Matthias stood. The movement was slow. The movement of a man whose body was processing the information his eyes had just delivered faster than his political instincts could frame a response. His brother was dying on the floor. The most powerful duke in his kingdom stood over the body with a bloody sword. And the established order of Valedorn, the careful, calibrated hierarchy of crown and nobility that had sustained the kingdom through generations of internal tension, lay shattered alongside the prince's body in a spreading pool of crimson on white marble. "Guards," the king said. His voice cracked on the single word. Voss stepped forward with his sword still drawn. "Your Majesty, I would advise against—" "Stand down, Captain." Caedric's voice carried a quality that Voss had never heard from him. Not command, not threat, weariness. The profound structural weariness of a man who had been holding up a ceiling for 11 years and had just felt the last support give way. "Everyone stand down." Caedric released his grip on Aldrich's blade. The steel slid free from his ruined hand and clattered on the marble with a sound that seemed louder than the entire fight that preceded it. Blood poured from the deep lacerations across his palm and fingers, mixing with the prince's blood on the floor until the two became indistinguishable. He sheathed his own sword. Then he turned to King Matthias. "Your brother is dead because he attempted to murder Lady Seraphina Vale in your throne room, in front of your advisors, after orchestrating the assassination of Duke Aldrin Vale, the forgery of treason documents, the corruption of a member of my household, and an armed attack in your palace corridors that killed your own guards." Caedric's voice maintained its clarity through sheer disciplinary force. His body was losing the battle with blood loss. His left hand hung at his side, dripping steadily. His face carried the gray undertone of a man whose circulatory system was beginning to fail the demands being placed on it. "The evidence is in the ballroom, the shipping manifests, the forged letters, the bodies in the eastern corridor. Your brother built a conspiracy that killed an innocent man and nearly killed his daughter, and he did it to protect a weapons trafficking operation that funded his political ambitions at the cost of your kingdom's security." Matthias stared at the body on the floor. His brother, his blood, the man who had stood 2 steps behind him on every public staircase, close enough to project unity, far enough to maintain separation. The geometric precision of that positioning took on a new meaning now, not deference, but measurement. Aldrich had spent years calculating the exact distance between himself and the crown, and every step had been preparation for the moment he would close it. "He was selling weapons to the Confederacy," Matthias said. Not a question. The tone of a man assembling the pieces of a picture he had been refusing to examine. For years. Duke Vale discovered the operation. Your brother had him executed under fabricated treason charges to bury the evidence. "And you knew?" "I suspected. I confirmed it through the port manifests after I took Lady Vale into my protection." "Protection?" The king's gaze moved to Seraphina, who stood 3 feet from the body of the man who had murdered her father, holding a blade she no longer needed, wearing an expression that Caedric recognized because he had worn it himself at 23. The expression of someone watching the architect of their suffering die and discovering that the death does not fill the space the suffering created. It just changes the shape of the emptiness. "You claimed her as property," Matthias said to Caedric. "Before my court. Before the tribunal. I claimed her in the way that would make every faction hunting her believe she was an asset rather than a witness. Property is protected for its value. Witnesses are eliminated for their danger. I needed the court to see value, not danger. And the 47,000 gold sovereigns? The price of keeping her alive long enough to expose the truth." Matthias sat down heavily. The throne received him with the unyielding hardness of carved stone. No cushion, no comfort, Just the rigid architecture of authority pressing against a man who was realizing that authority, without the strength to wield it, was just an expensive chair. "Leave us," the king said to his advisors. They filed out. Voss hesitated at the door, looking at Caedric with the expression of a man who had served another man for 11 years and was not certain the man he was looking at now was the same one he had served. Something had changed, not broken. Changed. The way metal changes when it passes through fire. Same material, different structure, different tolerance for what had previously been impossible to withstand. "Voss." Caedric did not turn around. "Find a physician." "For you?" "For the hand I am going to need if any part of what comes next is going to work." Voss left. Seraphina lowered the blade slowly. The motion had the careful deliberation of someone setting down a weight they were not sure they were finished carrying. She placed it on a marble ledge beside the doorway and stood with empty hands, looking at Aldrich's body, looking at the blood on the floor, looking at the man who had caught a blade meant for her chest, and was now standing in a throne room that smelled of iron and consequence, with an expression she had never seen him wear. Not power, not control, not the calculated coldness that had defined every interaction she had experienced with Duke Caedric Dravenmoor since the night he claimed her before the court. Uncertainty. The genuine, unshielded uncertainty of a man who had just demolished the last wall between himself and the world and was standing in the open for the first time in 11 years without knowing whether what remained was strong enough to survive the exposure. "Caedric, your hand needs—" "Caedric, look at me." He looked at her. The throne room was quiet enough that Seraphina could hear his breathing, ragged, controlled through effort rather than ease, the rhythm of a body running on reserves it did not have. Blood continued dripping from his left hand onto the floor. Each drop produced a small sound on the marble that punctuated the silence between his breaths. "You caught the blade," she said. "Yes." "With your hand." There was insufficient time for a more elegant solution. "You could have lost the hand. The alternative was losing you." The words arrived without decoration, without the strategic framing that Caedric applied to every statement like armor applied to vulnerable surfaces. Raw. Exposed. The verbal equivalent of catching a blade bare-handed, an act that bypassed every defensive mechanism and made contact with the thing it was trying to protect through the most direct and most damaging path available. Seraphina's eyes filled. She did not cry. The fluid gathered and held, suspended by the same force of will that had kept her standing through 2 months of captivity, a public humiliation before the aristocracy, a political conspiracy designed to destroy her, and a night of violence that would have broken people with twice her physical strength and half her psychological architecture. "I spent 2 months hating you," she said. "Every day in that tower, every dinner at your table, every conversation where you performed the role of the captor so convincingly that I built my entire resistance around the belief that you were exactly what you appeared to be. I was what I appeared to be." Caedric's voice carried the heavy honesty of a man who had stopped constructing narratives and started reporting facts. The man who claimed you at the tribunal was not pretending. He was a man who had spent 11 years governing through possession and control, and the decision to protect you was made through that framework because it was the only framework he had. I did not lie about what I was. I withheld the reason behind it because the reason required admitting that something existed inside the architecture that the architecture was designed to prevent. And what was that? He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that exists between the decision to speak and the speech itself, when a man is measuring the distance between the truth and his ability to survive saying it out loud. The capacity to lose something I could not replace. Seraphina crossed the distance between them. Not quickly, not slowly. With the measured pace of a woman approaching something she had been circling for months without knowing it. A man who had dismantled himself in stages across a single night until the machinery of fear and control lay in pieces around him, and the person underneath stood exposed in a throne room that smelled like blood and demanded nothing except honesty. She took his wounded hand. He flinched, not from pain, from the contact itself. The sensation of someone touching the part of him that had been damaged in the act of protecting her, the physical evidence of a choice that had cost him control, cost him invulnerability, cost him the calcified architecture that had kept him functional for 11 years. She was holding the wound and the proof simultaneously, and the intimacy of it bypassed every remaining defense he had not yet dismantled. "This needs stitching," she said quietly. "Most things do, after they have been torn open." The physician arrived 20 minutes later. He worked on Caedric's hand in the throne room antechamber, while palace officials dealt with the body and the king dealt with the political earthquake that the night's events had triggered. The lacerations were deep but structurally manageable. Tendons intact, bones unbroken, the damage confined to soft tissue that would heal with time and immobilization. Caedric sat on a stone bench while the physician stitched. Seraphina sat beside him. Neither of them spoke during the procedure. The silence between them had changed quality, no longer the pressurized silence of adversaries calculating their next exchange, but the decompressed silence of two people who had survived something together and were now sitting in the aftermath, processing the altered landscape of a world that looked fundamentally different from the one they had inhabited 12 hours earlier. Over the following weeks, the political machinery of Valedorn ground through the consequences of the Winter Ascension Ball with the slow, inexorable force of institutional self-correction. The shipping manifests were examined. Aldrich's weapons trafficking network was documented, traced, and dismantled. 14 noble households were implicated in various levels of complicity. Lord Fenwick, Lord Heron, Count Braemar, others whose involvement ranged from active participation to willful ignorance to the specific brand of political cowardice that consists of knowing something terrible and choosing silence because silence is easier than consequence. Duke Aldrin Vale was posthumously exonerated. The treason charges were formally vacated. His name was restored to the aristocratic records. His estates, already stripped and redistributed, could not be physically returned, but the legal acknowledgement that he had been murdered for discovering a conspiracy rather than executed for participating in one gave his daughter something that no amount of territorial restoration could provide: the truth. The specific, documented, politically ratified truth that her father had been an honorable man destroyed by dishonorable forces, and that his destruction had been a crime rather than a consequence. Seraphina received the formal exoneration notice in the East Tower of Blackthorn Keep, delivered by a royal courier who made the 4-day ride from the capital in 3. She read it standing beside the same window where Voss had first told her about the winter ball summons, the same view of the northern sea, the same cliffs, the same wind hammering the fortress walls with the persistent fury of natural forces that did not care about political outcomes. She read it twice. Then she set the document on the table and stood quietly for a very long time, watching the waves break against the rocks 300 feet below, with the expression of someone who had just received the answer to a question that had been shaping every thought, every decision, and every act of resistance she had committed since the day her father was taken from her. The answer should have been enough. It was not, because the truth about her father's death did not resolve the truth about her own life. The exoneration closed a chapter. It did not write the next one. And the next chapter required confronting the fact that the man who had imprisoned her, protected her, fought for her, caught a blade for her, and dismantled his own psychological architecture in front of the entire aristocracy was standing somewhere in this fortress, waiting for her to decide what happened now. She found Caedric in the war room. His left hand was bandaged in clean linen, the fingers immobilized by a splint that the physician had insisted on despite Caedric's clear contempt for anything that limited his physical capability. He was standing behind the war table, reviewing military dispatches with his right hand, his posture carrying the tension of a man who had been forced into stillness by injury and was tolerating it the way a caged animal tolerates captivity, with visible restraint and zero acceptance. "The exoneration arrived," Seraphina said from the doorway. "I was informed. My father's name is cleared." "Yes." "His estates cannot be restored." "No. The redistribution was finalized before I intervened. The legal framework does not permit reversal." Seraphina entered the room and stood across the war table from him, the same position she had occupied the first time she challenged him about Lord Cresswell's mining projections. The same geography, different people, or perhaps the same people, finally standing in the positions they had been moving toward since the night she arrived at Blackthorn Keep in chains, and looked at the most feared man in the Northern Territories with an expression that refused to perform the submission he demanded. "What happens to me now?" she asked. Caedric set down the dispatches. His gaze met hers across the table with the unguarded directness that had replaced his calculated control since the night in the throne room. The transition was not complete. 11 years of behavioral architecture did not dissolve in weeks. There were still moments when the old patterns surfaced, the coldness, the strategic framing, the instinct to convert every interaction into a power dynamic with himself at the apex. But the moments were shorter now, the intervals between them longer. The man emerging from behind the demolished walls was rougher, less polished, less certain of himself than the man the walls had protected. He was also, Seraphina was beginning to understand, considerably more real. "That depends on what you want," he said. "Since when does what I want factor into decisions made inside this fortress? Since I stopped being the man who believed that controlling outcomes was the same as surviving them." The words landed with the specific weight of a truth that had been purchased at maximum cost. Caedric did not elaborate. He did not frame the statement in strategic context or soften it with qualification. He stood behind his war table with a bandaged hand and an expression that carried the raw, uncomfortable vulnerability of a man who had discovered that strength without the willingness to be damaged was just rigidity, and rigidity was just fear wearing a more expensive uniform. Seraphina walked around the table. She stopped beside him, close enough that the space between them carried the physical memory of every confrontation, every guarded conversation, every moment of compressed tension that had defined their coexistence since the tribunal. "I want to stay," she said. Caedric's breathing changed, a single sharp intake that he caught and controlled almost immediately, but not quite immediately enough to conceal the fact that the statement had breached a defense he did not know he was still maintaining. "Not as a ward," she continued, "not as property, not as collateral for a debt that never should have existed." "Then as what?" "As someone who chooses to be here, with full knowledge of what this place is, what you are, and what it costs to stand beside a man the entire kingdom fears. The cost is considerable. I have already paid most of it." Caedric turned to face her fully. His right hand, the undamaged one, the one that still functioned with the precision and strength that his left hand would need months to recover, reached toward her face. He stopped the motion halfway. The hesitation was not uncertainty about whether she would accept the contact. It was the hesitation of a man who had spent 11 years touching nothing without the intent to control it, and was now attempting to touch something with the intent to simply be present. The recalibration from one to the other required crossing a distance far greater than the 6 inches between his hand and her face. Seraphina closed the distance for him. She took his hand and pressed it against her cheek. The contact was warm, solid. The physical evidence of a decision that both of them had been making in increments since the night she stood in chains before the tribunal and looked at him without fear, and he looked back and felt something fracture beneath the iron surface of a man who had forgotten that fractures were not always structural failures. Sometimes they were the lines along which something rigid finally learned to bend. Spring came to the Northern Territories the way it always did, reluctantly, violently, with storms that battered the coastline for weeks before the sunlight finally broke through and turned the frozen landscape into something that could sustain growth. The black pines along the ridgeline sprouted new needles. The frozen ports thawed. Trade ships from the southern provinces appeared on the horizon for the first time in months, their sails catching the warming wind like signals of a world that had survived its own winter and was beginning the slow, difficult work of renewal. Blackthorn Keep changed too, not architecturally. The stone walls, the iron bracings, the towers that had weathered centuries of storms remained exactly as they had been built, massive, unyielding, designed to endure. But the interior shifted, gradually, in ways that a casual visitor might not notice, but that anyone who had lived inside the fortress for years would recognize immediately. The corridors carried sound differently, not the echoing silence of a military installation, but the layered texture of a household that had begun to breathe. Voices in the kitchen, footsteps that moved with purpose rather than caution, the specific acoustic signature of a building that contained people who were present by choice rather than obligation. Seraphina's influence was not decorative. It was structural. She reorganized the household management that Marin's departure had left in disarray. She reviewed trade agreements with the precision she had learned from her father. She challenged Caedric's military spending allocations with arguments detailed enough to force revision and sharp enough to produce the particular expression of frustrated respect that had become his default response to her involvement in governance. They argued, frequently, about taxation policy, about military deployments, about the treatment of minor lords whose loyalty was questionable and whose territories required either integration or elimination. The arguments were not the careful, weaponized exchanges of their early coexistence. They were the raw, productive collisions of two minds that operated on different assumptions and arrived at different conclusions and refused to defer to each other out of deference to position or history or the asymmetric power dynamic that had defined their relationship from the beginning. The asymmetry was dissolving, not because Caedric had relinquished power, but because Seraphina had accumulated it, through competence, through presence, through the gradual establishment of herself as an essential component of Blackthorn Keep's operational architecture rather than a decorative addition to its domestic landscape. The kingdom noticed. Rumors spread through the aristocracy the way they always did, through servants, through merchants, through the invisible network of information that connected every noble household in Valedorn to every other. The ruthless Duke of Dravenmoor had changed, not softened, changed. The distinction mattered. Softening implied weakness. Change implied adaptation. The strategic reconfiguration of a man who had recognized that the operational model sustaining him for 11 years had reached the limits of what it could produce and had made the terrifying, deliberate decision to evolve. One evening in late spring, Caedric stood on the rampart overlooking the sea cliffs. The sun was setting through a break in the storm clouds, turning the water into hammered copper and throwing long shadows from the fortress towers across the cliff face. The wind was warm for the first time in months, not the cutting northern gale that had defined the winter, but something gentler, carrying the salt smell of open water and the distant sound of waves against rock. Seraphina found him there. She stood beside him at the parapet and watched the sunset without speaking. The silence between them had become comfortable, not empty, but full in the way that silence between two people who have survived catastrophe together fills with shared understanding that does not require articulation. Voss submitted his security report for the quarter, she said eventually. The northern border is stable. 3 of the 5 implicated houses have formally surrendered their involvement in Aldrich's network. And the remaining 2? Negotiating. They will come around. Their economic position does not permit extended resistance. Caedric nodded. His bandaged hand rested on the parapet. The splint had been removed a week earlier, and the hand was functional again, though the scars across his palm and fingers would remain permanently, white lines against weathered skin that mapped the exact trajectory of the blade he had caught in the throne room. He did not hide them. He did not cover them with gloves the way the physician had suggested. They were evidence of a choice, and choices that cost something should leave marks. The king sent a formal request for a meeting next month, Seraphina added. He wants to discuss the restructuring of the royal council. He specifically asked for both of us to attend. Both of us. His words. Apparently the crown has developed a preference for dealing with Blackthorn Keep as a partnership rather than a dictatorship. The corner of Caedric's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The pre-structural formation of a smile in a face that had spent a decade treating smiles as security vulnerabilities. The expression appeared, held for a moment, and subsided without completing itself. But it had been there. And it appeared more frequently now, in small increments, in private moments, in the accumulating evidence of a man who was learning at 34 that the capacity for warmth he had sealed behind iron walls at 23 had not been destroyed by the ceiling. It had been preserved. Waiting. Seraphina. Yes. If I asked you something I have never asked another person in my life, would you give me an honest answer? She looked at him. The sunset caught her face and turned her dark eyes into something luminous. I have never given you anything else. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the salt air and the distant cry of seabirds wheeling above the cliffs. Am I worth staying for? The question arrived stripped of every defense, every strategy. every layer of control and calculation and carefully maintained invulnerability that Caedric had used as insulation between his interior and the world for over a decade. It was the single most exposed thing he had ever said. More exposed than catching the blade. More exposed than defying the crown. More exposed than standing in a throne room covered in blood and declaring that the woman beside him mattered more than the empire around him, because those acts, however costly, had been responses to external threat. This question was an internal one. The question of a man who had spent his life making himself indispensable through fear and was now asking whether he could be wanted without it. Seraphina held his gaze for a long, steady moment. Then she took his scarred hand, the one that had caught the blade, the one that carried the permanent evidence of what he was willing to sacrifice, and interlaced her fingers with his. "You were not when I arrived," she said. "You were a man who mistook control for safety and possession for connection, and the fortress you built to protect yourself had become the thing imprisoning you. You were brilliant and brutal, and absolutely terrified of the one thing your power could not guarantee. And now? Now you are a man who caught a blade with his bare hand for someone he spent 2 months pretending to own. A man who tore down his own walls because keeping them standing required sacrificing the only person who had ever seen through them." She tightened her grip on his scarred fingers. "You were not worth staying for when I arrived. You became worth staying for by being willing to become someone who could ask the question." The sunset burned through the last break in the clouds and ignited the surface of the northern sea into a field of molten light that stretched to the horizon. The banners of House Dravenmoor cracked and thundered on the towers above them, the wolf crest snapping in the wind with the violent energy of something alive, something that had endured storms and sieges and centuries of relentless pressure and was still standing because the things built to last are not the things built to be comfortable. They are the things built to withstand the specific forces that try to tear them down. Caedric stood on the rampart of Blackthorn Keep with the hand of the woman who had survived his worst and demanded his best, and for the first time in 11 years, the fortress around him did not feel like a defense against the world. It felt like a place worth defending. Far below, the northern sea continued its ancient assault on the cliffs. It would continue for centuries more. The stone would hold. It had been built to hold, and the man standing at its highest point, scarred and altered, and finally, irreversibly changed by the collision between who he had been and who he had chosen to become, understood something that no amount of military strategy or political calculation had ever taught him. The strongest walls are not the ones that keep everything out. They are the ones built with a door,